Hey everybody. Hope you're doing well, and welcome to the mini lecture for evolution. Um, so, what is evolution? Well, evolution is a theory, which means it's something that started as a hypothesis. Um, the original hypothesis was called descent with modification. That was thought up by Charles Darwin in the 1850s, and as such, the hypothesis, which is an educated guess based on, in his case, careful observation, well, that hypothesis has been tested and confirmed, tested and supported over and over for the last 170 years or so. And so that hypothesis has grown up and become a theory, which is how science works. Probably familiar to you. Um, but he got his ideas from, he was a British naturalist, which I think means he was very wealthy and had a lot of free time, and so did a lot of careful observing of the natural world, and somehow talked himself onto a naval sailing ship and traveled, I think, all the way around the world, and got his started developing his hypothesis in South America, um, first in Ecuador, and then on what in the Galapagos Islands. It started with beetles. He noticed there were so many varieties and species of beetle. He got his gears turning a little bit, and then he went out to the Galapagos Islands and studied the uh, finch, the different species of finch, and specifically their different beak shapes and sizes, and that kind of was the springboard for the whole theory. So, what is the theory? The theory of evolution speaks to this idea that 3.5 billion years ago there was that's when right around then is when scientists think life began as a single species without a nucleus, without any membrane-bound organelles, and from that single species, all of these other species, using the mouse here, all of these other species branched off into what we now estimate to be around 8.7 million species. I've seen that number in wildly different forms, so take that number with a grain of salt, especially when you consider all the species of bacteria and consider the fact that if you go 1 mile down under the surface of the ocean, you have a 50% chance of discovering a new species. So, have we discovered all the new species? I mean, pretty clearly, no. Anyways, how did it happen here on our planet that from one original life form species we've now developed into the, let's just say, tens of millions of species that we have on the planet? Well, evolution, the theory of evolution addresses that. And so evolution, here we go. So the theory of evolution, let me move myself over a little bit, that's good. The theory of evolution describes the way in which populations change over time. Okay, whoops. The ways in which populations change over time. So that would be a definition that you could use, right? Evolution describes the ways in which populations change over time. And so let's define from that description the word populations. Okay, so a population then is a member of the same species living in the same general area. And the example that always comes to mind for some reason is imagine there's a species of bullfrog, and there's a population, there's a group of 500 of those bullfrogs that live in Maine, and then there's another group of 500 of those bullfrogs that live in Florida. Well, yes, they're the same species, um, but they're in separate populations, right? Because there's really no way those two organisms, members of those populations, are likely to intermix. Okay, geographically separate enough that they're considered to be separate species. Which reminds me, we should define what a species is, right? A species, technically, a species is a group of organisms in the same population that can create fertile offspring, right? So organisms in a population that can create fertile offspring. So, for example, is a blue jay and a robin, are a blue jay and a robin members of the same species? No, because they can't make baby blobbins, right? Cats and dogs, the same species? No, because they can't make fertile offspring. And then here's a little bit of a trickier one. Are horses and donkeys the same species? Well, it turns out that horses and donkeys can create an organism called a mule, right? But horses and donkeys remain separate species because the mule is sterile. The mule cannot itself reproduce. So in that situation, horses and donkeys remain separate species. Okay, so then back to this idea. Evolution, the theory of evolution, describes the way in which populations change over time. A population is members of the same species living in the same general area, and those populations change over time. He came up with this hypothesis when observing all the different varieties in traits in the beetles. So let's talk about traits for a minute. And I think we have talked about traits, but anyways, a trait is basically a characteristic of an organism. That would be a vocabulary word. And traits come in 3 styles. Those styles are physical, behavioral, and metabolic or physiological. Physical traits, that's pretty obvious. Those are observable traits like size and shape and color and pattern, maybe. Maybe the morphology of an organism. A behavioral trait would be something like, is the organism nocturnal or is the organism diurnal? Or is the organism more likely to live in a group? If so, what size? Or more likely to live a solitary existence? That would be an example of behavioral style of traits. And then metabolic or physiological traits, I often think of as, think of it as metabolism, right? Metabolism is the building and breaking of molecules in a system, in an organic system. And to me, that means how are you getting and processing energy, basically. So, for example, we're heterotrophic. That's a metabolic characteristic, which means we get our energy partly by consuming other organisms, right? And what's another important part of our another important metabolic characteristic of humans? Well, yes, we could eat all we want, but if we didn't breathe, we wouldn't ever be able to convert those resources we've consumed into usable energy in the form of ATP, because we wouldn't have the oxygen, and oxidative phosphorylation wouldn't work. And so those are examples of metabolic characteristics. Whereas, compare us to a fish. Okay, so fish, largely the same, heterotrophic. I guess in this case, a metabolic difference would be the mechanism by which oxygen diffuses into our systems, right? Lungs versus gills. So those are metabolic characteristics as compared with, autotrophs, which are organisms that make their own energy. Plants and algae, any photosynthetic organism. So those are examples of metabolic characteristics. Okay, so the idea is that for any given trait, right, you can have variation of that trait. I think we looked at this slide once before, but anyways, So take a human trait, for example, of the physical trait of height. Well, if the trait is height, then the variations are, from 7'6" to 3'6", or whatever that range might be, right? Those are the variations in trait. If the metabolic trait for humans is the ability to digest lactose, right? You get those ranges. Really, really good at it, really, really terrible at it, and everywhere in between those are the variations of traits. Okay, so then the idea with evolution is that populations change over time because take a group of 100 organisms in a population. Let's go with our bullfrogs again, and let's say there are 20 of those bullfrogs that are perfectly suited for eating houseflies, and let's say 80% of the population has to eat fish, baby fish. I don't know, I'm just making that up. And let's say that one year there's no baby fish because there's been a terrible bit of pollution in the pond, and so the only frogs that are able to maintain a healthy enough structure to have offspring are the 20% of frogs that are able to eat the flies. Well, then let's say that situation continues for a couple of generations, let's say 10 generations, just to illustrate the point. Well, what happens over time is, right, the composition of that population changes, where originally we had 80% of the population eating fish, and let's say that 20% of the population could eat fish babies, but were also had traits that allowed them to eat flies as well, whereas that 80% didn't have those traits to allow them to eat the flies. Well, the population would change over time because that 80% would no longer be able to do the three things that populations need to do, and those three things are surviving, thriving, and reproducing. Okay, those are really the three words that come up over and over again in evolution talk. So that 20% of the population that could eat the fish and the flies, okay, were better able to survive because they had a food source, better able to thrive because they had energy for life activities, and better able to reproduce because A, they were alive, and B, they had energy. So over the course of 10 generations, if that situation stayed static, which they generally don't in the real world, but let's just say for the purpose of this talk that they did, well, then that population would change a decade later, right? You would find much more of that population, much more than 20% of that population, is able to eat fish and flies, and probably by at that point, in my scenario, there would be 0% of the population that could only survive off of fish, eating baby fish, because there hadn't been baby fish for 10 years, and so that was no longer an option. Well, that's a population changing over time, and that's evolution, right? So the idea is, okay, that there are traits, physical, behavioral, and physiological, and any trait you can imagine in an organism has variations, okay? And those variations that allow an organism to be better at surviving, thriving, and reproducing, those trait variations are called adaptations, okay? And that's what an adaptation is, which is right there. Adaptation is a trait variation that allows an organism to be better at surviving, thriving, and reproducing. Okay, so that's the basic intro, and then here's kind of how that's applied. It's often said that the mechanism of evolution is natural selection. Okay, well, what does that mean? That means that the process by which evolution occurs, let's say one of the processes by which evolution occurs, and probably the major process, is called natural selection. And all that means is that the environmental conditions that the population exists in, those environmental conditions determine which trait variations are adaptations, or which trait variations allow an organism to be best suited for surviving, thriving, reproducing in those particular environmental conditions. Okay, so natural selection is the process in which the environment determines which traits are beneficial, which traits are not, and as time goes on, right, those beneficial traits allow members of the population to survive, thrive, and reproduce. And after generations of selection pressure, which is pressure put on the population by the environment that allows for different rates of surviving, thriving, and reproducing. Those are called selection pressures. So after generations of selection pressures being applied to the population, the proportion, the distribution of trait variation in the population changes. Another way you could say that is, you could say that the distribution, the allele frequency in the population changes, right? It's the same idea, because the allele frequency determines the phenotype variations and proportions, and so it's the same idea. So that's natural selection. In this little picture here, right, we see that here's, if you're the beetle population, and the trait in question is the color of your shell, and the variation in that physical trait is clearly some are green and some are orange. Well, the environment at large determines that one of those colors of the shell is going to be better at allowing the beetles to survive, thrive, and reproduce. And in this case, the selection pressure that is being put on the population of beetles comes from these crows. And it turns out that, they love green beetles. And so clearly, the trait variation that is an adaptation in this case is having an orange shell color, right? And so let's say this particular situation maintains for, 5 generations. Well, in this original population, there are only 3 orange beetles out of I'm not sure how many. But, 5 generations forward, most of them would probably be orange, because the green ones had mostly been eaten. Okay, so that's evolution. Okay, what else do we need to know? We need to know, yes, the famous case of the peppered moth, and then we'll stop this video, and then I'll do another one. So you may or may not have heard of the famous case of the peppered moth. This is from Industrial Revolution era Britain, and the idea was that the peppered moth was a moth that lived in Great Britain, and the trait in question was the coloring of the moth. Some of the moths were mostly black with white speckles, like the one on the top. Some of the moths were mostly white with black speckles, like the one on the bottom. And what happened was the Industrial Revolution started, which meant that Great Britain started burning an awful lot of coal, which meant that there was a lot of soot put into the atmosphere, and that soot settled down into the environment, onto the trees, which these peppered moths were, over the course of time, had adapted to be camouflaged on the bark of the tree. Well, as the soot settled onto the trees, clearly what happens is the trees turn darker, right? So suddenly, this one on the bottom had been really good at blending in with the tree, but suddenly this moth that's white with black speckles really sticks out, easy to spot on these suddenly soot blackened trees. And so, guess what happens? Well, the birds who love to eat moths, suddenly start eating more white moths than they were before, which means the dark-colored moths are finding themselves in a position to be more likely to survive, thrive, and reproduce. And as this situation continues over, let's say, the next 30 years, well, the population of peppered moth changes, the distribution of traits in the population, of trait variations, we should say, in the population of peppered moth changes significantly, to the point where the majority of the population of the peppered moth is now black with white speckles, right? So that's a pretty clear and somewhat recent observable result of natural selection. And okay, humans caught on that soot was not great for the environment and started doing things to prevent the release of soot from the burning of coal to greater and lesser effectiveness. But anyways, as the amount of soot in the atmosphere decreased, well, the amount of soot settling on the trees decreased, so suddenly the trees were not quite as black with soot as they were before. So then guess what happened? Well, the moth on the bottom, the white moth with the black spots, became the moth that was better able to camouflage in the tree, less likely to get eaten by the bird, and more likely to survive, thrive, and reproduce. And the population changed over time again. And evolution kept happening, right? So that's like evolution in a nutshell. We'll talk about more of the details, but that's enough to get started for now. So, hope you enjoyed, and talk to you later.